Hey guys, welcome back to thedirtytank.com. My name is Andrew and I have over 30 fish tanks in my house, in my fish room. But today I want to talk to you about the 10 biggest mistakes I made in my fish keeping journey. And hopefully after this video, you'll be less likely to make these mistakes yourself. All right, mistake number one, and this is a big one. I lost probably $300 to $400 worth of fish by just one mistake. And if you guys don't hear anything, definitely listen to this one. So I think if you have 3 or more aquariums, then you definitely want to make sure you follow this routine. If you have less than 3, then I still suggest that you follow this, but it's not going to be as impactful or practical for you. But mistake number one was not following my quarantine regiment. So everyone knows you need to quarantine new fish just to make sure if they come with any diseases or infections, they don't infect all your other fish, right? But I have a system to do that, but I just wasn't following all the time. I had a fish tank with between $300 and $400 worth of fish, and I added 2 Plecos to that tank that I just bought online. And instead of quarantining them, I just threw them right in the tank. And about a week later, I started seeing 2, 3, 4 fish just die. Next day, 3 or 4 more fish die. And it went on that way with a handful of fish dying every single day for almost a week. That entire tank was wiped out, right? There was only 2 fish left that survived. It was an electric blue ram crossed with gold ram, and I think like a swordtail. Those are the only 2 fish that survived. Every other fish died, and it really hurt, right? Those are one of the moments where you stop and you actually think, should I just get out of the hobby, right? And that's why it's so impactful. Like that scenario happens time and time again to fish keepers, new and old. And when it does happen, I see it, right? Maybe half the time people just give up and they're like, you know what, it's not worth it anymore. You know, because $300 to $400, that's a lot of money, you know, especially for a hobby. So if you take anything out of this, go ahead and get a quarantine tank set up, and it will really make sure everything goes smoothly and you don't lose some of your favorite fish that you had for a while. Now, if you're curious on how I set up a quarantine tank, I did make a video about that and about this scenario that I just now talked about. Go ahead and watch that video next if you're interested in setting up a quarantine tank. But let's go ahead and jump to mistake number 2. Now mistake number 2 is pretty trivial, but it helps so much. Now, if you're not going to do it, you'll be doing your maintenance a little bit slower, but overall, it's not going to kill you, but it is a game changer. And the mistake number 2 is not using a Python or Python water change type system sooner, right? When I first started fish keeping, I had a 5-gallon, and then I got a 20-gallon, and then I got some 10 gallons, right? And you know how you slowly acquire more and more tanks. Well, when I just had the 5-gallon, yeah, doing a water change into a bucket and then taking that bucket and dumping it out and redoing that several times works, right? It's labor intensive, it takes a while, it's messy, but it works. And I say if you have more than 2 or 3 tanks, or if you just have 1 tank, but it's larger, right? Larger than 20 gallons, I normally recommend you getting a Python type water change system. Now, if you haven't gotten one of these, it is a game changer, right? All you'll have to do, it's essentially a siphon hose that can connect to your kitchen faucet or your sink faucet or your outdoor spigot hose. It will connect to all those. One end goes inside the tank, the other end connects to the faucet, and then the faucet will push water out and down its own drain, creating a siphon which then pulls out the water from your tank, and then it goes down the drain of your sink. And that's essentially how it works. And then whenever you want to refill it, you just twist the knob, and instead of coming straight down, it goes through the hose all the way into your tank. And so it's really simple and really easy. You don't have to carry, buckets of water to do your water change and then to refill your water. And it just makes it so much easier. You won't use as much, there won't be as much of a mess when you're done either. It's just cleaner because it's simpler. Now, this is going to be really handy for people with larger tanks, people with mini tanks, or people who just don't have the capacity to lift, buckets of water multiple times, right? So if you're older, or if you have like back issues or arm issues, or if you just something going on with you physically, no matter what it is, doing water changes could be a big deal. And so if you don't have a Python, or the Higer version, or the there's tons of, Amazon brands of the Python water change system that is just a bucket list water change system that works so well. I'll leave a link in the description below to the one I use. It's been working great. I use it on my tanks. I use it on my customers' tanks because I also do aquarium maintenance, and it just makes things really simple. Now, mistake number 3 is pretty interesting, and this probably won't affect everyone, but it's becoming more and more popular, so it will affect a good bit of you guys. But most of my tanks are dirted. That's why we're called the dirty tank. And one of the mistakes I made was adding too much dirt. Now, if you add too much dirt, there really isn't such a thing as too much dirt. It's more of too much dirt in relation to the types of plants you decide you want to use, right? And for the type of plants that I like using are really low maintenance, low tech, and sometimes even slow growing plants. And because of that, some of these plants that I prefer to use don't necessarily utilize or benefit completely from dirty tank. And they may not absorb as much nutrients in the water as what's available, which would cause ammonia outbreaks or algae outbreaks, right? And so for the type of plants that I like to use, I had entirely too much dirt. And so instead of the traditional 1 inch of dirt and 2 inches of sand, I like to do maybe whatever that is, right? A dusting, a little bit more than a dusting of dirt at the bottom, maybe, a half a centimeter worth of dirt, and then 2 inches of sand. That's my preferred, ratio now based on the plants that I use. I like using Anubias, I like using jungle val, I like using cryptocorin, I like using java fern, I like using bulbitis, right? And a lot of those plants are either slow growing or epiphyte type plants, which means you don't plant them into the substrate. Now, some of them you do, and they do benefit from the dirt a lot. But what happens if you have too much dirt and if you have too much organics, 1, it could cause an ammonia outbreak, but 2, it causes a lot of algae if they're not being absorbed by other plants. Now, the third thing that it does, and I found this out recently, is that it contributes to the spreading of cyanobacteria, right? Which is that blue-green kind of film jelly looking stuff that kind of coats the surfaces of everything. It's no fun. It's fairly easy to get rid of, but you would rather just prevent it altogether. And normally having a little bit less organics, using less dirt, will help with that. Now, the fourth mistake that I made is really has to do with shrimp tanks, specifically Neocaridina. Right now, when I first started with cherry shrimp, they would die. Back like time and time again, they would die. Right, I'll buy them 2 weeks later, they'll die again. I'll buy another pack 2 weeks later, they'll all just slowly die off. And I couldn't figure out what I was doing. Right, it wasn't the water changes. I wasn't doing any water changes, or just very small water changes because I know they needed to acclimate. But what I discovered is that most of my shrimp were dying due to a failed molt, right? Which means that as they're shedding their exoskeleton, which is how they grow, what would happen is if there isn't enough minerals or calcium in the water column, then they can't fully shed that exoskeleton, and instead it gets stuck on them. And when that happens, they just can't move, and they'll either slowly starve to death, or because they can't move, they'll get eaten by other fish or other shrimp, or other organisms that are there. And so what I found is that crushed coral helps add those extra minerals in the water that make sure that my shrimp are able to shed their exoskeleton just fine. And since then, my shrimp have done amazing. And not only have they done amazing, but I sell shrimp online and in person all the time. I've probably sold thousands of shrimp, and it's all thanks to crushed coral. Now, mistake number 5 is kind of, I guess, controversial depending on your outlook and how long you've been in the hobby, and depending on where you live. Now, I live in the United States, and so that's going to be important, but mistake number 5 is using heaters in your indoor aquariums, right? Now, I have about 30 aquariums. All of my indoor ones, last week, I took the heaters out of all of them. All these tanks no longer have heaters. Only my garage tanks have heaters now because it does get cooler in there during the winter. Now, the reason why I don't use heaters in my indoor tanks anymore is because, well, I keep the whole house heated or cooled depending on the season, right? And so my house normally sits around 70 to 74, somewhere in that range, which is right where tropical temperature should be, right? And the other reason why I got rid of heaters, other than they're just not needed inside for if you have central heat and air like I do, is that it also uses the most power, right? The power consumption that it uses is greater than all the other devices you use on your fish tank combined, right? And so if you guys want to know how much electricity your fish tank uses or how much electricity each equipment uses, I made a video about that details exactly how much I was spending in electricity and how much each equipment cost from an electrical or electricity perspective. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and check that out. But what I found is that the filter, the light, right? And those are 2 standards that you'll probably use on your aquarium. You combine the electricity usage, it's still less than what a heater would output. And so it was just a no-brainer. Take the heaters out of your tanks if they're inside and you have central heat and air, because you really don't need it. Now, mistake number 6 was not using floating plants or house plants in my aquarium sooner, right? So now if you've been watching my channel recently, I have house plants in just about all my tanks. I have floating plants in every single one of my tanks. There isn't a tank in my house or garage or outside that doesn't have floating plants in them. And the reason why is that they do such a great job of absorbing those excess nutrients, which will make sure you don't get high nitrates or ammonia or algae issues, right? Because we don't want algae issues. And the reason being is that floating plants like duckweed, dwarf water lettuce, Sylvania minima, frog bit, red root floater, whatever floating plants you have, they grow so quickly, which means they consume nutrients a lot quicker than other plants. Now, in addition to that, they obviously have access to the atmosphere with excess oxygen and CO2, which allows them to grow faster than aquarium plants that are underneath the water, right? And house plants do the same thing, right? A lot of people, you see pothos growing out of their tank, or inch plant of monstera, or creeping jenny, right? There's tons and tons of house plants that you can use that grow out of your fish tank. And I actually made a video about that too. So if you want to know what house plants I use in my fish tanks, go ahead and check out the video where I take you around showing that. But guys, if you don't want to use house plants in your aquarium, that's okay, but at least use floating plants. Here, I'm going to overlay a picture of before and after. So of one of my aquarium clients, right? Before he started using floating plants, there was algae covering the front of the glass every few weeks when I returned to do the maintenance. But after I put the floating plants in, whenever I returned to do the maintenance again, there was no algae, right? Now, that's not to say that if you get floating plants, you'll never have to do maintenance. No, that's not true. You're still gonna have to do maintenance, but it's gonna be a lot less than you would think. Now, mistake number 7 is really only applicable if you have more than 3 tanks. So if you have multiple tanks, this is a good piece of advice for you. And that is not keeping tanks closer together, right? So if we look inside, right, inside my office here, I have, I don't know, 5 or 6 tanks. And it takes about the same amount of time to do these tanks as it does to do all 20 something tanks in my garage. And the reason for that is I have some tanks over there, some tanks back there, over here, one tank over here, one tank in that other room, and the tanks are just spread out all over the place. Whereas in my garage, they're all right next to each other. So doing the water changes becomes very, very easy. I never have to change water sources. I never have to drag the hose across the house and make sure it's not kinked or tangled up among something. And so having your tanks together, if you can, makes it so much easier to do maintenance and really just enjoy them all in one spot. And so if you plan on setting up a fish room, make it all in one area instead of scattering throughout your house. It makes maintenance a lot easier. All right, so mistake number 8 is not feeding high quality food. So, you know, when you first get into fish keeping, you're like, okay, let me get the cheapest food and let me just feed this thing. Let me make sure I can keep them alive. But once you get past that phase of keeping your fish alive, you start to bond with it and you want it to grow, you want it to have a good life. And part of providing your fish a good life is feeding good food. And there's 2 ways to achieve this. One, make sure you have a good quality food, right? And the best way to know that is, what I notice is that all the better quality foods normally have a breakdown of the analysis of that food, right? How much is protein? How much is soldier fly larva? How much of it is krill? How much of it is, and so on and so forth, right? And if you don't see that information, or if you do see it, but you see that most of it is just fluff ingredients, then maybe that is not something you want to feed your fish. So that's one way to know if you have a high quality food, is look at the breakdown analysis. And the second thing that will really help make sure in terms of feeding your fish and feeding them well is making sure they have a varied diet, right? Imagine if you ate the same fish food or the same human food every day, right? Imagine you had spaghetti, right? Whatever your favorite food is, whether it's spaghetti or pizza or hamburgers, right? If you ate that every single day, you would love it for the first week, the first 2 weeks, but after that, it starts to get really, really old, right? And you may not even like your favorite food anymore. And so there's tons of food you can feed them, right? So in addition to flake food, I personally feed frozen food, and I just get a whole bunch of different frozen food packets. So I feed them mysis shrimp, I feed them brine shrimp, feed them bloodworms, copepods, rotifers. There's probably more. The list goes on and on. There's so many different types of food that you can feed your fish that are relatively cheap, or that you can find in your backyard pretty easily. Now, mistake number 9. Now, this is really my mistake, and maybe some of you are making this mistake too, or maybe not. But mistake number 9 is not using Plecos sooner. Now, I've never been into Plecos. I know that half the fish community is going to be upset hearing someone doesn't like Plecos. But I wasn't really into Plecos all that much. And I kept trying to get other types of algae eaters like pandagars or autocinclus or snails, and they all do a great job. Yes, they do. But Plecos do a phenomenal job at controlling algae. And I didn't get my first Pleco till maybe a year ago, right? And that's it. And now I have Plecos in every single one of my tanks, unless they're a nano tank. But in a 10 gallon or above, I have some type of Pleco in that tank. And the reason being is they just control algae so well. If you couple Plecos with floating plants and house plants, you got the trifecta of a low maintenance tank in terms of algae scrubbing, right? They just do a great job at keeping the glass clean. Now, to your point, yes, they do poop a ton and their turds are huge, right? But if you keep more of the modestly sized Plecos, you won't see as large as turds, and they still do a really good job, such as your clown Plecos or your bristlenose Plecos or your super red, which is a variant of your bristlenose. But they do a great job at eating all the algae, and I have them in all my tanks now. Now, mistake number 10, this is really just a beginner mistake. Most people who have kept fish for greater than a year kind of figure this out, but I still see this time and time again where people don't change this up. But mistake number 10 is using disposable filters, right? You ever seen those filter cartridges that you use, and then once it gets clogged up, you throw it away, and then you put a brand new one in there? It blows my mind. And I used to do that for the first little bit when I first got into fish keeping, and using permanent filter media is the way to go. One, because you don't have to rebuy it, and then two, because you're throwing away the thing that is keeping your aquarium alive. The chances of something going wrong when you change it just increase, right? Whether it's ammonia spike or your cycle crash, whatever it may be. It's more likely for that to happen if you're constantly getting new filter media. And so what you should do instead is get the filter sponges, or even use your lava rock or Biomax ceramic little beads. There's tons and tons of different type of permanent filtration that you can put in your filter that is easy to clean, easy to use, easy to install, really cheap to buy, and work 10 times better than the disposable filter cartridges. Alright guys, and those are my 10 mistakes. I hope you guys learned something, and let me know in the comment section down below what your mistakes were. I would love to learn from those as well. And until next time guys, I'll see ya.